toda esta situación, murió mi compu en el mejor momento. Didi, veo que estás ahí, así que todo bien. Bueno, empecemos. Bueno, ahora sí, le damos la bienvenida a todos. Este es el tercer día de nuestro encuentro nacional sobre registro, documentación y conservación de arte contemporáneo. Hemos tenido 2 jornadas súper intensas y la verdad que para hoy tenemos esta conferencia súper interesante que ahora mismo vamos a presentarla a nuestra invitada, pero recuerden que luego tenemos 2 paneles muy intensos y llenos de presentaciones también súper interesantes. Así que a quienes nos puedan acompañar durante el día, ya saben que si tienen alguna complicación técnica por Zoom, van a poder seguirlo por YouTube y queda además después ya en el canal de Cultura a disponibilidad. Y por otro lado, comentarles que como ya conocen la dinámica, pero seguramente alguien es nuevo y se ha sumado hoy, se pueden hacer las preguntas a través del espacio de preguntas del usuario ENAC Preguntas o eventualmente el chat, y a quienes nos siguen por YouTube podemos también tomar en cuenta sus preguntas que agreguen en la sección de comentarios. Así que una vez dicho esto, vamos a darle la bienvenida a nuestra invitada desde Países Bajos, desde Holanda, como solemos decir en Argentina. Ola Diverge es holandesa y ha tenido la amabilidad de decirnos que a ella sus amigos internacionales la llaman Didi, lo cual para nuestra falta de manejo, por lo menos la mía, del idioma de su país, es muy simpático y más fácil. Dice que todas la podemos llamar así y que por supuesto le va a interesar mucho escuchar y recibir sus preguntas. El tema del que va a hablar Didi hoy es un tema que es muy interesante. Es interesante conocer la perspectiva que ella va a presentar y cómo se ha venido trabajando desde hace muchos años en su país. Por lo tanto, para nosotros es un tema, entre comillas, no sé si nuevo, pero su abordaje y la manera que ella lo presenta nos va a llenar de preguntas y nos va a llenar de curiosidad por entender por qué en otros países por ahí se lo ve desde otra perspectiva, ¿no? Tan diferente a la nuestra y de otros países de la región quizás. Bueno, brevemente, Didi tiene mucha trayectoria. Ella también, luego van a ver su presentación, ella misma va a hacer una breve reseña a su carrera, pero les comento que es máster en museología, especializada en Baja de colecciones, es consultora de museos y desde 2015 trabaja desde su consultora Creative Consultancy, una de las pocas firmas que se dedican se ha especializado en procesos de baja de colecciones y en ayudar a las instituciones ante esta posibilidad que ella considera que debe ser tenida en cuenta dentro de una buena gestión de colecciones. Desde 2017, Diverge es consultora del Ministerio de Cultura de Países Bajos. Así que, bienvenida, Didi.
Gracias, gracias. Hola a todos la gente. Voy a hablar un poquito en Spanglish y me van a ayudar si no entiendo todo, pero espero que vosotros tienen un buen tiempo con mi presentación y si hay preguntas, déjame saber. Y vamos a ver.
Muy bien, perfecto. Entonces, ahora vamos a ver su presentación.
Hi, everybody. So nice of you to tune in for my presentation on the accessioning of contemporary art, or in Baja, the colecciones de Arte Contemporáneo. I would like to start with thanking Florencia for her trust in me. It's an honor to present in your conference. It's a shame, though, that I'm stuck here in the Netherlands because of COVID, but I hope that one time we'll meet in person. I know that my contact of the Dutch Cultural Heritage Agency boasted that my Spanish is fluent, but I'm so sorry I have to disappoint you. My regular Spanish is super okay, but my museological vocabulary is a bit too small to keep this talk in Spanish, so English it is. Let me start with introducing myself a bit. I'm Diewertje Wijsmuller, but my international friends call me Didi, so please feel free to do so as well. I have a master's degree in museology, and I've specialized in deaccessioning. Due to that, I was one of the founding mothers of the Foundation of Disinherited Goods. I think it was the first foundation in the world that helped museums and city councils in the deaccessioning process. I left the foundation in 2015 to work on my independent consultancy firm, Creative Culture Consultancy. And since then, I've been working on collections management issues with museums and city councils and other organizations that have collections. I am one of the advisors of the National Board of Culture, which helps the Ministry of Culture to tackle difficult problems in the museum world. In 2008 and 2018, I did research on the possibilities and attitudes towards deaccessioning in Europe, and I hope to do this again in 2028. A Dutch radio presenter once called me the Marie Kondo of the museum world, and that's a name that I really, really like. These 45 minutes will be filled with deaccessioning. I could talk for hours with you on this subject, but I've tried to keep it as compact as possible. We'll talk about deaccessioning in general in the start, and towards the end, we will focus more on art or contemporary art. First, we set a definition of deaccessioning and where it stands in museology. Then we talk about why we should deaccession, followed by how we should do it. And since the subject is relatively new in Argentina, I will give a short history of deaccessioning in the Netherlands, which might give a more clear view on how we came to the current situation. I will give a few examples on some issues raised in a talk we had before this conference, and we'll finish with a recap, tips and tricks. The examples will cover good practices and some less good or bad practices, so we can learn so that you don't have to make the same mistakes. We already did that for you. This is my last assignment I did in a museum in the Netherlands, in the north of the Netherlands. You know that to the outside world, museums look structured. They look like structured organizations that have knowledge and they know how to safeguard the heritage of humanity. We as museums have the image that we have everything sorted out, all objects registered, preferably digitized, and have storage spaces that look impeccable. Unfortunately, we all know, at least in the Netherlands, that this is not always the situation. We all deal with inherited chaos, which is part of the fun, isn't it? But still, we have our predecessors that all have made choices, or chose not to make choices, for that matter, that we now have to deal with. As museum people, it feels super contrary to do deaccessioning, because what we've been taught is to safeguard it for eternity, to keep all objects in the best possible conditions so that later generations can enjoy it, look at it, research it. We were not made to eliminate them. But with ever-growing collections, we stand for a grand task as museums. How do we keep the collections manageable? Deaccessioning is a good instrument for that. So, let's begin. The definition of deaccessioning. There are different definitions of deaccessioning. I will give you the one from ICOM that they wrote in 2019, and then I will give you mine, or more common use in the Netherlands, because the ICOM definition is quite general. But that is, deaccessioning is the act of lawfully removing an object from a museum's collections. I prefer to say that deaccessioning is the process of transferring objects, including responsibilities and ownership, which is quite important, from the museum managing it to another managing institute or public body via exchange, sale, donation, or repatriation. If no public body wants to take the object, private new owners or managers can be found. As a last resort, total destruction of the object is a possibility. As I said, I think that the process of finding new owners is at least as important as the removal of an object from its collections. The care of the object doesn't stop with removing it from the collections. We need to make sure that it gets a good new life, to say so. I will give you a bit of museological discourse theory now on where deaccessioning stands. I think you probably all know this scheme. It is by the famous Dutch museologist Peter van Mensch, who was my teacher. And he talks about musealization of objects. It has an object has a primary context and a use value, and whenever somebody decides to put it in a museum, it gets a new context and a new value because it's museum value. If we try to explain the scheme in real life, to say so, we can explain it by this famous sentence by Kenneth Hudson: "A tiger in a museum is a tiger in a museum, not a tiger." Do you feel the difference? I hope so, but let's see. Let's look at this picture. This is a Bengal tiger attacking a four-horned antelope. It's an exhibit in a Great Plains Zoo in Delbridge Museum of Natural History in the United States. And it's interesting to do some fact-checking here. This is where the Bengal tiger lived. And this is where the antelope resides. So a tiger in a museum is a tiger in a museum and not a tiger. It has changed value and it changed context. When we go back to the scheme, I have altered it a bit to give space to deaccessioning. This is it. I've added a third context, a tertiary context. It's the realm of remusealization or demusealization. Both are forms of deaccessioning. However, I prefer this term, demusealization, because deaccessioning means or looks like it's not accessible anymore. And I think that demusealization or remusealization shows that it could be accessible. There are a few options for an object. They could go back to the primary context, although with a tiger that would be a bit difficult. It could stay within a museum field, keeping it in a secondary context, keeping it with a museum value, or it could get a new context. It could get other values. It could get a new museum value, as I said, or a new use value, saying that somebody will be able to use it again and touch it again. It could get a reuse value, which means that maybe it's changed into something else, it's recycled. And it can go back to primary value or lose its value if it's destroyed. Well, in case of the tiger, this is the primary context, which is difficult to get back to, but then when it's shot, it goes to the museum value and its secondary context. And then if we want to deaccession it, we have some options, which are a reuse, it's changed into something different, or it has a secondary context again and is just placed in another museum. Why? Why do we need to deaccessioning? As I said, deaccessioning is a process that feels really unnatural to most people in museums. However, the way I look at it is that it is an essential part of good collections management. We just can't keep on collecting forever. The more objects we safeguard, the less money and time and effort is there to keep available per object. The chances of not keeping track of the objects in storage space grows, enlarging the chances of losing them. Everybody remembers the object that they put somewhere in the storage space and just don't know where it went. And we could decide to keep on building storage spaces, but the questions are, how much money is there still left to start another storage space? And why shouldn't we be able to make selections within our collections to be able to keep the storage spaces we have and really look critically at our collections? In 2011, ICRON did a survey in the museums all over the world, and it shows what I just said. This is almost 10 years ago already, guys. 2 out of 3 museums have a lack of space. 1 out of 2 museums, which is 50%, have a lack of storage units or overcrowded storage units. 2 in 5 museums have a lack of management support for storage-related activities or trained staff or a backlog. And we should really think about this. When we keep collecting, we won't be able to get rid of this. Even we make the problem bigger. So, why should we consider deaccessioning? I think that there are 2 main groups in which we can divide the reasons. That's practical reasons and curatorial reasons. The following reasons all come from the ECOM guidelines on deaccessioning, which you can find on the internet. So, practical reasons. The physical condition of the object is so poor that restoration is not practicable or would compromise its integrity. Objects that are damaged beyond repair are of no use for study or teaching purposes and may be destroyed. Second one, the object poses threats to health and safety to our staff and the public. The museum is unable to care adequately for the object because of its particular requirements of storage or conservation. And the last one, another museum could more appropriately care for, display, and provide access to the object. And it is the intention of the originating museum to assign ownership of the object to that other museum. Then, curatorial reasons. The object is a duplicate that has no added value as part of series. The object is of poor quality and lacks aesthetic, historical, and/or scientific value for exhibition or study purposes. The third one, the authenticity of or attribution of the object is determined to be false or fraudulent, and the fraudulent object lacks sufficient aesthetic, historical, and/or scientific value to warrant retention. In disposing or deaccessioning of a presumed forgery, the museums shall consider all related legal, curatorial, and ethical consequences, and should avoid returning the object to the art market. The fourth one, museums' possession of the object is inconsistent with applicable law or ethical principles. For instance, the object was or may have been stolen or illegally exported or imported, or the object may be subject to other legal claims for return or restitution. Or the object is no longer consistent with the mission or collecting goals of the museum. The last one, the object is being sold as part of the museum's effort to renew and improve its collections, in keeping with the collection goals approved by the museum's governing body. Then, there are always reasons why you shouldn't deaccession. I've used 2 examples where this example is from my own practice. It is in Dutch. It was an email, but I've blacked out all the data of names and stuff like that. And I will translate it for you because it's really the core of what you shouldn't do in my eyes with in these situations. Hi, at the end of the month, Mr. X will say goodbye from his work. The city council wants to give him something that will remain as a memory. Do you think there's something in your museum collections that we could give away and it could be a nice present? For instance, a painting or something else? If you know something, let me know. Thank you for thinking with me. Kindest regards, the City Councillor of Culture. Really, guys, I think this I don't know how it works in your countries, but this is absolutely not how things should go. Another thing that is really, the ICOM says that we shouldn't do is deaccession for profit. the ECOM guidelines state that the sale of objects for financial gain is excluded as a valid reason for deaccessioning. However, in the United States, since COVID-19, the American Association of Museum Directors have broadened these possibilities. It is due to the COVID-19 virus that it has brought so many museums in financial problems. So this week I saw that the Brooklyn Museum is selling 12 works of art to save the museum. It would be really interesting to hear from you how you feel about this. Should the museum have the possibilities to sell to save the museum and to save with that a lot of jobs? Or does the heritage value prevail, and should we be doing everything in our power to keep the heritage that is now in the storage spaces? So if you want a deaccession, how can you deaccession? For me, deaccessioning is always a part of this bigger process. It should never ever be a goal per se. In the Netherlands, we have developed a guideline for the deaccessioning of museum objects and an appraisal tool in order to be able to select and appraise the collections on an objective manner, or an intersubjective manner for that matter. Our law makes it possible as well. And I know that this is not very common in the world yet. This thinking enables a curatorial decision-making process. It gives context and an intersubjective base to make decisions on. Without knowing why you collect what you collect, you can't make a rational content-based decision on what not to keep. In countries where collection policies are not common, like in Argentina, the deaccessioning reasons will be mainly practical. But as we see later on, the thinking about deaccessioning tends to start with this practical thinking about practical reasons about deaccessioning. And during the development of the discourse, there will come more space for curatorial considerations. In the Netherlands, it took about 30 years to get here. No, 20 probably. But it is really a thought process, needs a lot of thinking and discussing and even making mistakes to get there, I think. But if you don't have a collections policy, and when you're planning to deaccession an object from your collection, there are a few possibilities. And what you can do depends on the legislation and regulation in your own country or province or even region. In the Netherlands, we first have to offer to other museums, preferably for free. And other museums, in Netherlands, the museums all are independent foundations, while the collection is owned by several governmental bodies or by another foundation. So every transfer between the museum we call a deaccessioning. But I know that it's different in other countries. But if no museum wants a work of art or an object, for that we have a website where you can check which objects are available. You can offer it to other public institutes. So it could be a hospital or the local library where you think that they can still use the object for whatever purposes they like. If there is no public institute that is interested in the object, in the Netherlands, then we can go to the private realm. We can decide to sell it to somebody, we can decide to give it to somebody, or we can even destroy or reuse the object if nobody is interested. It is interesting though that we try to, here in the Netherlands, try to keep the selling process as transparent as possible. So we prefer auctions instead of making the appointments with one buyer, so that everybody knows that it's for sale and everybody can have a chance to buy it. Nowadays, next to the Foundation of Disinherited Goods, we have more companies that try to help selling to the private realm. And of course, if you tried everything and no new owner is found, you could decide to keep it if you find this your ethical duty, or you could destroy it. And if you decide to keep it, you can decide to keep it in your storage space and not be part of your collection, but you think that it shouldn't be destroyed and you keep it for later purposes. Or you could decide to reuse it in your own collection or reuse it in your own museum as a use object, so that maybe children can touch it, or you can destroy it by researching the materials. So that's possible as well in the Netherlands. This is a photo of former museum objects being destroyed. So it's proof that it happens in the Netherlands. Yes, then how? There are, before the act of removing the object from the collections, please consider the following points. Know your legislation and regulation in your country or region, as I said. And research if it has any effect on the possibilities of deaccessioning. It might be not even possible. I know that in Spain and France, and probably even in Argentina for that matter, or Italy, there is by law, if it enters a museum, a national museum, it is protected for deaccessioning. It really needs a process of bajar to be able to give it away or sell. And I know that in France it doesn't happen because it says so explicitly in the law that it is that museum objects are inalienable, it's called. Then please consider who is the owner of the object. Are you sure that your museum is the owner, or is it a loan? It might be that it's been in your collections for ages, but it's still a loan for somebody. Or is the national government or the local government the owner? In the Netherlands, it's rule that the owner has the last decision. So you as a museum can say, I don't want to keep it anymore, but the owner can say, we think you should keep it. Then you as a museum have to oblige to that. If there are no such things as legislation, you can follow the ECOM guideline of Code of Ethics, and you can even use their guidelines on deaccessioning. Then the donor. If you know that the object has been donated, please check if there are any contracts of the donation in which the donor states that it is or it isn't possible to deaccession to remove the object from the collections. And the provenance, you should be able to prove the provenance is okay. It is a due diligence thing, but you need to know if you can explain where the object came from. If you can't explain or some parts are missing, you need to do more research before you can say we're gonna deaccession it. And then especially for contemporary art and modern art, what could the consequences of deaccessioning be for the artist, for the maker? Have you thought about a possible dip in the market value, maybe even? Because as a museum, you have a status of knowledge, and if you decide to not keep a work of art, that could mean something for the maker. And then the copyright of the artist. Do you know how it works in your country? In the Netherlands, in case of total destruction, the artists have no claim on copyright. But how does it work in your country? It might be different, I don't know. And this is for all museums. Have you considered the possible consequences of the deaccessioning for the image of your museum? I know that a lot of people are very afraid of this. And I know from my experience in the Netherlands, there are always people who oppose to the deaccessioning process or what you want to do and how you want to do it. And there are always people who will go to the newspapers and say that the Museum X is doing ridiculous stuff and they don't know what they're doing and they're throwing away heritage. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. But you can make it this chance as small as possible with the following rules, which are called art. You have to be accurate, you have to be responsible, and you have to be transparent. And this sounds easy, but it means that deaccessioning can be a very lengthy and therefore expensive process if you want to do it really right. Especially with the heritage that the former curators or collection managers left, because not everything was registered well. Sometimes, I know in the Netherlands, it just happens that there's a box filled with stuff on the door of the museum, and then somebody thinks, oh, I'm going to take it in, and then somebody else puts it in storage space, and then somehow somebody registers it, and then you're responsible for it, and you need to know where it came from. So it can be quite difficult, and it's a really cool puzzle to do, but can be quite difficult. So how can you be accurate, responsible, and transparent? First, start by organizing a team of people or a committee so you can discuss the deaccessioning proposal and share the responsibility of the decision. It's so very more nice to have it as shared decision. You can look at people that work inside your museum, but as well, you can think about experts outside your organization. Clearly document the reason why an object must leave the collection and use criteria that are as intersubjective as possible. So, I don't like it is not a good reason. If it doesn't fit the collection's profile or is a hazard for your health, it is a good reason. And then inform your stakeholders. First, know your stakeholders and then inform them. The artists, the donors, the owners of the collections, of course, the general public, the media. Make sure you are proactive in saying, we are planning to do this. And we're going to do this for the following reasons, which are in your document. And we made this decision with those people, which is your team. And then stand there and don't be afraid, because critics will come, but you know why you did it and how you should do it. So then you have a good foundation to go further on. Then, in short, because we only have a quarter of an hour left, the history of deaccessioning in the Netherlands. I think that the Netherlands are a typical Western European country in which we are, how do you call it, maybe less emotional about heritage than in the more southern Mediterranean countries, which showed from my research. And we always had some kind of a merchant attitude, I guess. So deaccessioning from collections has always been, without giving it a name, an act of collections management. I've seen archives in which the museum director says, well, we have here a cupboard or even a work of art that shouldn't be here. So we sold it to Mr. X, or we sold it even to our museum employees. Okay, now we think, how could that be possible? But it was quite normal in that time. And in the 19th century, we as the Netherlands sold this part of a church interior to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, in which it's still visible. It's a beautiful part, and there was one guy who wrote in 1873, I think it was, an article about how the Dutch people were throwing away their heritage and they didn't think it was important. And it was really the first time that somebody mentioned that we should keep our heritage and be and safeguard them. So then it walked on, and everybody was a bit deaccessioning or not, or under the radar, until the 80s, where this Mondriaan was owned by a city council in the center of the Netherlands, and they decided to sell it because they needed money for a new theater. And that was, I think, the real first time that the museum world in the Netherlands all said, no, we should stop doing this, because now it's short-term thinking. This is a Piet Mondriaan, we need to keep it. It's super important for our history and our art history. So under pressure, the city council sold it to the Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam for a much lesser price than it could have achieved, because everybody thought it should be in the public realm of the Netherlands. But from then, it really started the thinking and the discourse and the discussion about deaccessioning. There were a lot of conferences, there were a lot of guidelines. The first guidelines were only 2 pages on deaccessioning, and nowadays, since 2016, we have a heritage law in which deaccessioning is mentioned. We have a LAMO, which is the guideline of the deaccessioning of museum objects, and the last version is 2016. And this one focuses really on the how to deaccession when you've reached your decision on what to deaccession. But then the strategic process before that, how do you come to the decision what you want to deaccession? They wrote, and they, as the Cultural Heritage Agency, wrote the Accession Museum Collections, which is almost a think practice on what and how does it fit your collection, and it is you learn how to put museum objects in different contexts, and national context or a local context, or even within your own museum collection context. And they give you some values on how you can think about the collection. So it could be artistic value, which is important for art history museums or art museums, but it could be social cultural context or value as well. So if you have, let's say what should we do? If you have typewriter that was of utmost importance of your local city because it was the first typewriter that ever entered, I don't know, City Hall, you have a very important cultural social value. So you should keep it on that reason. You shouldn't keep it on artistic reasons, because a typewriter doesn't have really artistic value, maybe some, but most of them don't. So, some examples. In one of our meetings before this conference, we talked about some issues that Argentinian museums may have. And I understood that there's a difficulty with deaccessioning the exhibition copies of photos of a photo exhibition. So I asked my curator friends here in the Netherlands, how do they do it? And one of my friends said, well, I organized an exhibition of Rieneke Dijkstra, which you see here in the Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam. And what they did, and what is, I think is common in the Netherlands, they asked, of course, the artist who's still alive, we want to do an exhibition about your work. And she gave permission for making exhibition examples, exhibition copies of her work. So these are not part of the original edition of the works of art, so it's not one of 5, but it's an extra copy. And these copies have to be destroyed afterwards, and you need to make, as a curator, you need to document the destruction of these objects, because the artist demands to know that they are destroyed. So as a museum, you don't have the rights of the work of art. You don't own the works of art, but you need to destroy them in order to make sure it doesn't enter the market. In this, transparency is key, especially towards the artist, but as well, I can imagine, towards your museum employees or even the media. Keep in mind that we don't call this deaccessioning, since the works of art are never registered as official part of the collection, but I thought this was really a question that you had. So I hope it's answered now. So that's a good form of deaccessioning. Then, this one. This is Schoolboys by Marlene Dumas, a South African artist living in the Netherlands, and she is one of the best paid artists in the Netherlands. This is a big work. It was owned by a museum in the Netherlands, and they decided to change their collections management or policy, I'm sorry. So they decided to quit contemporary art, which is fine if you want to do that, of course. And he decided to sell his work of art. What he forgot to do is to say this to other museums and say, hey guys, I have a Marlene Dumas, who wants it? Because you're obliged to do that. And he sold it to a buyer, and afterwards it turned out that they already had contact about the Marlene Dumas before he decided to change the collections profile. So it was a bit weird that it leans towards a not very open and clear game, if you understand what I'm saying. So the museum field really said, guys, we shouldn't be doing this, but he already did. And there were no real consequences. And that was a bit weird. They threatened consequences, but it didn't happen. So he didn't follow the art rules. He wasn't accurate, he wasn't responsible, nor transparent. Then, this is a Dutch museum which I work for. And they received a couple of years ago a very big donation of an art collection of a private buyer, private collector. This museum collects and presents Dutch post-Second World War art. Dutch post-Second World War art. The donation, however, consisted out of this Dutch post-Second World War art, but as well some Belgian artworks, or works from Belgian artists. In deliberation with the donor, the museum sold all works of art that did not fit the collection's policy. And with the proceeds, they were able to buy another work of art that did fit the policy. And the museum was happy with that. The donor was happy that he could help get the museum's collection profile even better. And the city council and the rest of the museum world were really like, oh, this is a good way to de-accession. And this proves that being transparent and responsible and knowing your collection's profile is super important and good to work in a de-accessioning process. Then the last example, which is I'm afraid the last good example, is not a museum, but is a city council. And this is a work of art that was given or donated by a wealthy citizen when there was a new swimming pool opened. But however, there was never any form of contract signed. Nobody felt responsible for maintaining the work of art in good condition. Hence, it fell apart, as you can see on the second picture. Then, a few years later, the city council could not find the artist nor the donor, and the people who are maintaining the green of the city council wanted to throw away the old iron trash, which you can understand seeing this. So what to do? If you can prove due diligence, you have really tried hard to find the maker or the donor, but it leads nowhere, and the object is officially declared total loss by an official art appraiser. You need to do that. If you have done that and it is declared officially total loss, you are allowed to remove and destroy the artwork. And total loss in this means in this regard, the cost of restoring the work of art are far higher than the monetary value of the work. So this was the people, I think this was, they did their due diligence, but it's still very painful that you just can't find the artist and then you have to decide to destroy it. However, it is practical. So, for the last section, the recap. De-accessioning is not an easy one-trick pony process. It takes time and knowledge, and every process is different. And you need to have joint efforts to make it a good process. Every country, please be aware of it, every country has its own regulations and legislations. Make sure you know them. If there's no legislation, use this or as an advantage to be able to move and make your own decisions, or use the ICOM guidelines on de-accessioning. Make sure that if you start de-accessioning, that it is art. Take an accurate, responsible and transparent. And take in consideration all aspects that have been mentioned and try to share responsibility. Document the process really well and inform everybody in time. Be proactive, it really works. And then, don't forget, it should be fun as well. It is really fun. It really helps your museum to get a stronger profile, to have less stress because of all the objects that are in your storage space and you don't know what to do with it. And it gives you more time to work on what's really important, saying the heritage that should be kept for the future. And I can imagine that in contemporary art, even though it's less common in the Netherlands to de-accession contemporary art, it happens. And it's difficult because you have next to your donors the artist that is still probably alive, or if he's not alive, you have his offspring that can make it difficult. But talk, communicate with them and really make sure that you understand your decision and you stand by it and that you can communicate that. But before you've made the decision, talk with the artist or its offspring. It really helps. But then still, if you don't feel like de-accessioning, feel free to call me. I really love to help you. On a more meta level, which could be interesting, I think, maybe for Argentina or wherever, think about organizing a committee to talk about all aspects of the accessioning and start opening up the discourse in your country. And that is difficult because there are a lot of people who are opposing it, but there are even a lot of people who think it's a necessity because of practical reasons. And if you start talking about it and accept the practical reasons, you can start thinking about developing guidelines in which there's more room for the curatorial reasons. There's more room for thinking about your museum, thinking about the importance of the collection, thinking about it. If you're a museum of contemporary art, you don't need to keep old art. Give it away to some other museum, do it together. But you first need to start talking about it and even making mistakes, as I said. I think there's unfortunately no innovation without making mistakes, but you learn from your mistakes and you learn from everything you do. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope I've answered some of your questions, and I hope you have a lot of more questions now afterwards. Feel free to ask what you want. I don't know if I can answer everything, but I hope I can help you, and I hope I've helped you already. Ciao.
Ok, bueno, muchísimas gracias, Didi, excelente, súper interesante, y como vemos se comenta en el chat, muy clara, muy didáctica tu presentación, así que muchísimas gracias. Y bueno, tenemos algunas preguntas, por supuesto, anímense a sumar las que crean que pueden ser interesantes para debatir o conversar un poco el tema. Y también es muy interesante ver cómo fue todo un proceso, ¿no? Lo que se lleva hoy a cabo como una práctica corriente en Países Bajos o en Holanda, viene de una tradición, viene como desde una concepción que es cultural, ¿no? Entonces quizás a nosotros nos resulte nuevo, pero se entiende que es parte de un proceso que se viene desarrollando desde hace muchos años. Bueno, Didi, vamos a ir haciendo algunas preguntas. Vamos a probar en español, y también le voy a pedir a Ángeles Álvarez, está acá con nosotros. Ángeles trabaja desde la Dirección Nacional de Bienes y Sitios Culturales, como muchos de ustedes saben, desde el área justamente de registro y documentación, y en este sentido para mí es un soporte fundamental para complementar esta conversación con Didi. Bueno, vamos a ir a las preguntas. No sé, Angie, si hay alguna que te parezca como la primera para...
No, Didi, te pasé una referida a las donaciones y qué se hace en caso de que éstas tengan un cargo, se le dice, como que estés obligado a exhibirla, a conservarla y que quieras darla de baja.
Pues depende a qué está escrito en el contrato con artista o los heredores, porque pues lo voy a hablar en inglés, porque really it depends on what is written down in the contract, because if it is a contract that has been there for over 20 years or even over 1 year, the contract always prevails. If it says you as a museum have to pay for the cost, you have to pay for the cost. If it says it should be there for eternity, it should be there for eternity. But as I said, if you communicate with the artist or with the herederos, there is always a chance that you can try and negotiate. Because if you can say it's not possible for the museum to keep it this way, but we we can give you another opportunity, or taking it back, or say it's only there for 12 weeks a year or whatever, then you can get out of it. But if it's in a contract and there's no living art, there's no artist anymore, and the children of the artist don't want to negotiate, then you have a problem. So whenever some artist offers it to you, please read the contract and make sure that you don't sign up to things that the museum is going to get trouble with.
Ok, vamos a traducirlo breve para quienes no hayan entendido, aunque sea la idea general. La pregunta era ante el caso de una obra que fue donada con cargo de exhibición y con determinados requerimientos, si es posible, y de conservación por parte de la institución que recibe esa donación, si es posible considerar dar de baja ese objeto, si legalmente es posible. Entonces, Didi dice que por supuesto lo que prima es lo que figura en ese contrato, en ese documento de donación, y que siempre, digamos, punto 1, estar muy atento a lo que figura en un contrato de donación, porque puede haber problemas a futuro. Y si uno quisiera dar de baja y el artista está vivo, o los herederos, o quienes han donado la obra están vivos, eventualmente hay una posibilidad de negociación o de conversación. ¿Es así, Angie?
Sí,
¿Me perdí algo?
Sí.
No.
Y una cosa más, es que normalmente en Holanda, en el contrato, se dicen el museo se puede hacer con el obra de arte como quiera. Si nos doy el objeto, es para nosotros a decir.
O sea, ya pasa la responsabilidad y la toma de decisiones sobre el objeto, una vez que se ha hecho la donación, ya es a cargo de la institución, digamos. Entonces, lo que ella decía antes también es, si en ese contrato dice, en el contrato de donación, que hay que hacerse cargo in eternum, ¿no?, de la conservación y de la exhibición de la obra, y bueno, hay un tema legal, ¿no? Lo que prima es lo que dice el contrato. Así que muy interesante como pregunta. Muchas gracias. A ver, vemos alguna otra pregunta. Sería, wow, hay muchísimas.
Por ejemplo, en el caso de un robo, ¿se tramita la baja?
No. Se escribe en la inventarización, pero no se baja.
Otra pregunta interesante es si a nivel mundial has mencionado que has visto el caso en distintos países, ¿no? Y cómo es el criterio desde distintas regiones también. Si existe una norma o una ley con la que se puede entender el concepto de musealización, de demusealización, específicamente para arte contemporáneo.
Pues tengo miedo que no. Hay ICOM Guidelines for the Accessioning, pero no es específicamente por arte contemporáneo. Y las leyes de países difieren tan mucho que creo que no está posible, lástimamente, pero no. Tiene que hablar con los museos en su país para arreglar cosas y open up the discussion.
Abrir la discusión.
Sí, eso.
En el caso de la venta de la obra de Marlene Dumas, ¿era un museo público o privado?
Público. Pues no, no. Era un museo privado, pero el gobierno local se da dinero, entonces debe que the museum has to follow national guidelines for public museums.
O sea, tiene que seguir las reglas de los museos públicos, sí, porque el gobierno le da un respaldo económico.
Sí.
¿No? Ok.
Tengo una pregunta, Flor. En el
sí.
caso de venta a privados, ¿se puede vender fuera del país? ¿O tiene que ser una persona física, jurídica de los Países Bajos?
Depende a qué es el... nos tenemos una lista de obras de arte infalible. ¿Es una palabra? No. Infallible.
¿Infalible?
Sí, no se puede... they can't lose it. No se puede...
It can leave the country.
Sí, pero es una lista muy pequeña, pero cuando está en esta lista no se puede vender fuera Países Bajos, pero se puede vender en
Okay.
Holanda.
Inside.
Sí.
Okay, entonces no puede venderse a un privado fuera de los Países Bajos.
No, y no se puede vender a un museo público fuera de Holanda, sí, es una obra de arte muy especial.
Bien.
A ver, otra pregunta. Son tantas y hay algunas como muy largas. ¿Cómo se toma la decisión de tramitar una baja en una colección? ¿Cuándo se toma, la decisión de tramitar una baja en una colección? ¿Recomiendas que el número de inventario se conserve en la institución junto con la documentación del bien, aunque el mismo ya no esté en la colección?
If I understand right, the question is, do you keep the number, right?
Yes.
Well, there are two schools of thought in that. Yes, you keep the number and you keep it in the inventory and you register it as deaccessioned, or you delete the number, but you don't reuse the number.
Ok, entonces, hay dos maneras de resolver este caso, o dos visiones, dos criterios. Uno sería que directamente se borra el nombre, ¿no? Se borra el número, y ese número no se vuelve a utilizar. Y la otra es que sí queda registrado que se dio la baja, pero queda el nombre, ¿no? Esos serían los dos, el número, perdón. Y un caso sería, ¿no? Para preguntarte, ¿qué debería realizar un museo si el artista que donó por sus propios medios la obra, luego pide que se le devuelva?
So you say if an artist gives you a work of art and he wants it back.
Yes. Lo donó y luego lo quiere nuevamente.
Pues muy interesante. Quizá creo que depende a qué es en inglés. It depends on how important the work of art is for your museum. If it's really the core collection, I think you should communicate with the artist and say, you gave it to us. We are really happy with it. We want to keep it. And if you don't show it often, or it's not part of your core collection, I would say, if it is possible, give it back to the artist so it can be visible again for somebody else. But it depends on what's in the contract and what's possible within law. Again, it's a bit stupid answer, but...
Bueno, no sé si se entendió, supongo que sí, pero hago un resumen. Lo que ella dice es que si la artista donó la obra y es una pieza importante o icónica dentro de la colección, correspondería quizás, o una opción sería llamar al artista y dialogar y dejar en claro que si hubo ese acto de donación y la obra es importante, lo más lógico sería que quede en la institución. Pero bueno, eso es un caso complejo. También podría ser un respaldo para la institución el contrato, ¿no? Y la letra chica que tenga ese contrato como para poder proteger esa situación.
Yeah, but it is, in Holland, there's now a case of a lady who gave something to the National Museum, the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, 2 years ago, and now she says that she gave it while she was mentally unhealthy, and it's now by the high judges to decide if the museum is the legal owner of the work of art or it was given in a confused state of mind, which would make it able for her to get her work back. So it's difficult.
Bueno, entonces Didi menciona un caso que es real y de hace un par de años, que una persona, una señora donó una obra al Rijksmuseum en Ámsterdam, y ahora alega que en ese momento no estaba mentalmente sana, o por lo menos está buscando los medios legales para probar que como no está mentalmente sana, ha hecho eso o sea, no quiere tomar responsabilidad sobre esa decisión y está intentando recuperar la obra. Entonces, esos son casos que se van dando y que son complejos y que tienen que decidir la justicia y todavía no está resuelto, ¿no? Está en conflicto aún. Sí. Ángeles, ¿tenés alguna otra pregunta?
Estaba viendo, encontrando una, en relación, porque la baja se relaciona con el ingreso de obras, porque sucede que si ingresamos mucho, luego no tenemos espacio, y ahí es donde quizás nos planteamos también la baja. ¿Hay normativas sobre cuál es el procedimiento para ingresar bienes?
Can you translate that for me?
The accessioning is related with accessioning objects to a museum. Is there any kind of law or guideline related to accessioning that relates with the process later of the accessioning the objects?
No, would be very interesting to have. No. No, but I think it's interesting to realize, I don't remember if I put it in my presentation, but if you accession one object, you decide to not accession other objects in which you make a decision for objects, which is somehow a part of a form of the accessioning as well. But I think that if you accession, you should always think about why you accession. And if you accession and you're not sure if it's part of your core collection, then, as I said, put in a contract that you would be able to deaccession whenever you want to.
Entonces dice que no, pero que sí es un tema interesante, que de vuelta lo que sería importante es que en el contrato figure que si la obra uno entiende que no forma parte de la colección, una parte importante de la colección, el museo pueda luego después tramitar la baja, si es que así lo quiere a futuro.
Bueno, leemos una última pregunta. Si existen políticas precisas y legislaciones con respecto a la responsabilidad de incorporar objetos a las colecciones, ya que esto condiciona la cantidad de objetos que se puede albergar en una institución y los posibles problemas de sobrepoblación, ¿no?
Ayúdame, eso no entiendo.
If you have laws related to the responsibility to give accession to objects to a certain limit, considering that then this high quantity of objects has to be taken care of. I mean, is there any kind of regulation to limit, or is it just criteria and
No, there's no limits at all. Nowhere. I think that your storage space is the limit, and your available amount of time and money should be a limit. And that's not getting more, it's getting less. So that's
okay. And maybe to finish, this is just a question. I started to, to think. I'm very slow today, but now I think, in your experience, as you have been working on this subject for quite a lot of years, and several kinds of institutions and countries, which is the main reason why the accessioning is decided? Is there a main reason, or the one or two, or the most relevant you may mention?
now, as I try to explain in in my presentation, it starts with the practical side. So you notice the storage spaces are full, you're losing objects, but it transfers to the more curatorial side, which is what's the value of the object for my collection or my museum? I think that should be the main reason, the value, the intrinsic value for your museum, and not the practical, but it happens to start with practical. So it should always, for me, the main reason should be, why should I keep it?
Mm-hmm. Ok. Bueno, perdón, la pregunta que le hice fue cuál era el factor o los factores que ella veía como más relevantes en la toma de decisiones para dar la baja de objetos de colecciones. Y bueno, dice que si bien hay varios, y ya nos mencionó, y de eso se trató su presentación, lo que le parece fundamental es tener muy claro cuál es el perfil de la institución y que el objeto esté coherentemente incorporado a esa colección. Y ahí surge como, digamos, distintas cuestiones prácticas, y luego sí, desde un punto de vista más conceptual, de por qué ese objeto está dentro de esa colección. Y ese mismo razonamiento es el que da lugar a que fluya un poco la respuesta, ¿no? Si ese objeto está ahí, entre comillas, de más, pero sí se busca, si se da la baja, que esté mejor en otro contexto, ¿no? Donde realmente esté más reconocido, supongo, en su nueva institución, porque para nosotros quizás suena como muy antinatural, como lo decías en tu presentación, pero también porque no es algo corriente en nuestro ámbito, ¿no? O en nuestro país. Bueno, Didi, muchísimas gracias. La verdad, como dijimos al principio, iban a quedar muchas preguntas y quedan muchas ganas de seguir discutiendo esto. Así que esperamos poder encontrarte en persona en el futuro y que puedas visitarnos.
Sí, espero que sí. Una pregunta más. Me gustaría tirar una foto con todas las cámaras.
Muy bien. Ok, entonces le gustaría tomar unas fotos y los invitamos a todos a que se ubiquen para una fotografía.
Sí. Let me see. Yes. Thank you, guys. Super. Es por Instagram.
Muy bien. Bueno, entonces...
Muchas gracias para todos.
Bueno, agradecemos a Didi especialmente la confianza también, porque la verdad que a la distancia era difícil un poco establecer bueno, la temática y también dar lugar a este intercambio, pero la verdad ha sido muy lindo trabajar contigo en todas las comunicaciones previas que tuvimos. No quiero dejar de mencionar a Mijaela Hansen, que es miembro del Consejo de ICROM, junto conmigo y con otras personas, pero ella ha sido muy generosa. El año pasado estuvo en el encuentro anterior otra colega, también de Países Bajos, que para nosotros también fue muy, muy enriquecedor contar con la presencia de ella, así que agradecemos y anunciamos que el próximo panel va a ser a las 14 horas, el panel 3, moderado por Mercedes de las Carreras, tendencias y particularidades de la conservación de arte contemporáneo, nuevos criterios, nuevas materialidades, nuevos problemas. Así que, bueno, te despedimos, muchísimas gracias, y bueno, si pudieras ver las otras presentaciones, te invitamos en los sucesivos días, porque por suerte quedan en YouTube, que puedas ver cómo venimos trabajando desde estas latitudes. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a vosotros.
Gracias a todos.
I just sent you something that shouldn't be there. I'm sorry.